I remember the exact moment I realized something was wrong with how I saw myself. It wasn't during a failure, or an argument, or even a bad day. It was during a completely ordinary moment, one I almost ignored. Before we begin, please support Mindshift Stories by subscribing, liking the video, and leaving a comment. Your support helps us continue sharing meaningful stories with the world. I used to believe self-doubt was just part of being realistic, not pessimistic, just honest. That's how I explained it to myself. Every morning, I followed the same routine. Wake up before the alarm, lie there for a few seconds, staring at the ceiling, mentally list everything I needed to do that day. And somewhere in that list, almost automatically, I'd think, I hope I don't mess this up. It wasn't traumatic. It didn't feel heavy. It felt normal. At work, I was reliable. I showed up on time, I met deadlines. People described me as solid or consistent. Compliments like that always felt oddly incomplete, like there was something unspoken at the end of them. I smiled, nodded, and went back to my desk. Inside, my thoughts were quieter, but constant. Don't speak too confidently. Double check that email. Someone else probably knows better. I told myself this mindset kept me grounded. It kept me sharp. It kept me from becoming arrogant. But if I'm being honest, it also kept me small. The first crack in that belief came from something insignificant, or at least it seemed that way at the time. One afternoon, my manager asked me to present an idea during a team meeting. Nothing formal, just a quick explanation of a solution I'd been working on. My immediate reaction wasn't fear, it was certainty. They're going to realize I don't actually know what I'm doing. I remember nodding and saying, sure, while already planning how to soften my words, how to frame everything as a suggestion, how to make it clear I wasn't claiming to be right. The meeting room was quiet. People listened. A few nodded. No one interrupted. When I finished, my manager said, "That's actually a really strong approach. Why didn't you bring this up earlier?" I laughed a little, shrugged, said something vague like, I wasn't sure. He didn't push. The meeting moved on, but his question stayed with me longer than it should have. Why hadn't I brought it up earlier? Over the next few days, I started noticing small things, patterns I'd ignored for years, how I'd rehearsed simple opinions in my head before sharing them, how I downplayed my own effort when someone thanked me, how I felt uncomfortable when people agreed with me too quickly. It was subtle, but once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. Still, I didn't label it as self-doubt. That felt too obvious, too dramatic. I told myself I was just cautious. Then, something happened that made it harder to keep that explanation. A coworker, someone newer than me, less experienced, started taking the lead on a project I had quietly been guiding behind the scenes. At first, I felt irritated, not angry, just unsettled. I watched as people praised their confidence, their clarity, their decisiveness. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Their ideas weren't better than mine. In some cases, they were weaker, but they spoke like they belonged there. I remember thinking, how are they so sure of themselves? That question bothered me more than it should have. One evening after work, I sat alone in my car longer than usual. The engine was off. The parking lot was almost empty. I didn't reach for my phone. Instead, I replayed moments in my life: school, jobs, relationships. Times when I'd waited for permission that never came. Times when I'd assumed silence meant disapproval. Times when I decided not to try because failing would confirm what I already believed. That belief had always been there, quietly shaping my choices. I'm not quite enough yet. Not bad, not incapable, just not ready. And the strange thing was, I couldn't remember where it came from. A few weeks later, I ran into an old friend I hadn't seen in years. We grabbed coffee, talked about work, life, the usual updates. At one point, they said something that caught me off guard. "You were always the smartest person in the room. You just never seemed to know it." I laughed it off, but inside, something tightened, because that's not how I remembered myself at all. On the drive home, I thought about perception, about how differently people see the same person, about how confident some people appear from the outside while feeling uncertain inside. And then a quieter thought surfaced. What if the voice I trust the most about myself is also the least accurate? That idea stayed with me, not as a sudden revelation, more like a slow pressure. I started paying attention to the way my thoughts spoke to me, the tone, the assumptions. When something went well, I'd think, that was luck. When something went wrong, I'd think, there it is. It wasn't balanced, it wasn't fair. And for the first time, I asked myself a question I'd avoided for years. What if this isn't humility? What if it's just fear in a reasonable disguise? The turning point didn't come from a big event. It came from a decision so small it almost felt meaningless. The next time I had an idea, I didn't soften it. I didn't over-explain. I didn't apologize in advance. I just said it. My voice didn't shake, not because I was confident, but because I was tired. Tired of waiting to feel ready. The response was normal. No dramatic approval, no rejection, just discussion. And that's when it hit me. Nothing bad happened. That moment didn't erase my self-doubt, but it changed my relationship with it. I realized I'd been treating my thoughts like facts, like evidence, like warnings I needed to obey. But they were just habits, mental shortcuts formed over years of playing it safe. I started noticing how often I assumed outcomes without testing them, how often I interpreted uncertainty as a sign to stop instead of a sign to explore. Slowly, something shifted, not externally, internally. I began taking small risks that no one else would notice, saying, I think this will work, instead of, I'm not sure. Applying for things I didn't meet every requirement for. Letting silence exist after I spoke instead of filling it with doubt. Some days felt the same as before. Other days felt lighter. What surprised me most was how neutral the world remained. It didn't suddenly reward me. It didn't punish me either. It simply responded. That's when the real insight settled in. Self-belief isn't a feeling, it's a behavior. It's not about convincing yourself you're exceptional. It's about acting as if your perspective deserves space. For years, I'd been waiting to feel confident before I moved. But confidence doesn't come first. Movement does. I started to understand how many of my assumptions were self-created, how many limits were never tested. And with that understanding came something unexpected: empathy. I saw self-doubt everywhere, in confident voices, in quiet people, in hesitation disguised as logic. It made me gentler with others, and finally, with myself. Now, when that familiar voice shows up, the one that says, maybe you're not ready, I don't argue with it. I don't try to silence it. I just don't let it decide. Because I've learned something important. The loudest voice in your head isn't always the wisest one. Sometimes it's just the oldest. And maybe the real shift doesn't happen when you stop doubting yourself, but when you stop letting doubt be the final authority. So the question I sit with now is simple. If you didn't automatically believe every uncertain thought you had, what might you finally allow yourself to try?